Celtic were going nowhere fast. They'd not won the league in an age, not won anything at all really for quite some time. Then a former player turned up in the Parkhead dugout and changed everything. This is Jock Stein Celtic and why this team will never ever be topped.
Alright, here's the 411, folks.
Celtic were a disgrace by the mid-1960s, has won the league just once since the war and hadn't won anything of note since October 57 when they thrashed Rangers 7-1 in a League Cup final. Those days were long gone. The days of Jimmy Quinn and Jimmy McGrory banging in the goals for fun, the days of 6 titles on the bounce had been exchanged for finishing 9th behind teams like Ayr United and Clyde. They'd just lost another League Cup final to Rangers and the latest Celtic team was in the process of being broken up. Billy McNeil was leaving at the end of the season with interest from London. Bobby Murdoch had planned to emigrate to Australia. Bobby Lennox had Falkirk sniffing around his signature. Jimmy Johnston was even contemplating retirement. Jimmy McGrory had never really left the club spiritually, save for physically 8 years spent at Kilmarnock, 6 of which had been gobbled up by the war. Safe to say his 20 years in the Parkhead hot seat hadn't gone as swimmingly as his playing days had done. Roughly around the same time as his return, so too did the chairmanship of the club back into the hands of the Kelly family, who had previously been in charge towards the back end of the record-breaking 6 titles won in a row in the 1900s. It was Bob Kelly who fielded a phone call from the Dunfermline manager in the spring of '64. Normally I wouldn't bring it up, but I thought I better add, since the Par's boss at this time was a certain Jock Stein, a man who had masterminded Dunfermline's 1961 Scottish Cup final win over Celtic after all. Stein had been part of the 54 double winning Celtic team, the last from paradise to win the league, having taken the scenic route via Albion Rovers and Llanelli Town in his playing career. He was ringing his former chairman under the illusion of advice since he had been approached by Hibs for their vacant manager's post. Perhaps he had the ulterior motive to remind his former club of his existence. 10 months later, Stein was enveloped in a charge towards a potential double with Hibs, entering 1965, 2 points back but with a game in hand on Kilmarnock at the top of the table. January 30th, 1965 was a day landmarked in British history by Winston Churchill's state funeral. It was also the last Celtic match before the influence of Jock Stein swept over the club forevermore. On that day, just 14,000 turned up to Parkhead to witness Celtic's sudden uptick in form, 8-0 against Aberdeen. The following day, Jock Stein was announced as the club's new manager. Sean Fallon had effectively coached and managed Celtic through the anxieties and ailing health of Jimmy McGrory for quite some time. Fallon was the one who continued to coach the Hoops through until Stein became available in March. Chucked to one side were St Mirren leaders Kilmarnock whilst they progressed through the Cup semi-finals via St Mirren, Queen's Park and once again league leaders Kilmarnock. Jock Stein would finally arrive for the semi-finals, having scoped out Dundee gaffer Bob Shankly for his former post in Edinburgh. Whilst both Hibs and Celtic were still alive in the Cup, it was probably with great relief that one of Stein's first games in the job wouldn't be against Hibs in the Cup. After all, his final game at Easter Road was in disposing of Rangers in the quarter-final before he seamlessly drifted into the Celtic job, earning a 6-0 win in Airdrie in the league. You could tell this was going to be a different era, not because results in the league spiked immediately. Stein actually lost more than he won in the Championship in his first few months, but because the new manager was actually the manager. Like his countrymen south of the border at equally prestigious clubs, Bill Shankly at Liverpool and Matt Busby at Manchester United, Stein demanded full control. He would get it, and with that came a new Celtic, and like those aforementioned names, he would don the tracksuit and coach the team himself.
Could be something here. Gallagher. Oh, taken. Oh, McLaughlin has been taken. There he goes. Hughes. And oh!
The semi-final replay victory over Motherwell had been completed by John Hughes, who had been transfer listed by Stein. Whilst he would make the final starting 11, a fellow transfer listee, Jimmy Johnston, would not. One name that did make the team sheet that day at Hampden was Billy McNeil, who passed fit after a calf injury. He had been taken by Stein from the new boss's very first day, and maybe it was his introduction, or maybe it was McNeil's winning goal in the final itself that prompted him to reverse his decision to leave the club. All three names that I've just mentioned would remain at Parkhead for the foreseeable. A name that would be departing would be defender Jim Kennedy after 10 years of service with the club. His well-telegraphed decline was something Stein couldn't countenance in his backline if Celtic were to return to success. Another building block was Neil Mocken, a man hired in July off a Jock Stein recommendation and one that would devise a training regime that whipped Celtic players into gear. Now he had his fundamentals sorted, Stein needed some of his own players in. After Sean Fallon had been instrumental in bringing youngster David Hay to the club, Jock Stein's first proper acquisition was Motherwell's Joe McBride. Celtic needed a man to take all the goal-scoring onus away from Stevie Chalmers, and the forward who helped take Celtic to a semi-final replay a couple of months prior was the one designated to fulfil that task. In warming up for the new season, Celtic tiptoed over the border into Roker Park, where they whipped Sunderland 5-0. In further tune-ups arrived the League Cup group phase, where mixed fortunes against Dundonian clubs had Celtic on the ropes. However, they'd ultimately scraped through thanks to their results against Motherwell. With the end of August came the resumption of the Championship, where an early marker was laid down at Tannadice. Whilst Clyde didn't come as cleanly as they usually did, only going down 2-1, it was a 100% league record in advance of Jock Stein's first taste of Old Firm derbies as a manager on September the 18th. Thankfully for Celtic fans, no available footage could be sourced for this game, as a flurry of goals lent the way of Rangers and an injury to McNeil reduced Celtic's chances of recovery. With the first die cast into the title race, Stein made more changes. Inside forward John Divers was let go to Partick Thistle, and the manager made his first of many oscillations on the goalkeeping front when he replaced John Fallon with Ronnie Simpson as his number one. Not that Celtic appeared to need a goalkeeper in the coming weeks. Rafe Rovers laid down for goals 9-12 in a two-legged cup tie in the League Cup. Aberdeen was slapped for 7. The Cup Winners' Cup run began with 6 in the Netherlands, and Hearts were beaten 5-2 well into October. Jimmy Johnston had booked his ideas up in training, and now he commanded a spot in the starting 11 for the more important games. He was there during a 4-0 triumph over Hibs in a League Cup semi-final replay, and there once again at Hampden 5 days later for the final against Rangers. It was Stein's most important game yet.
Sportsmanship game pursued. Goal! Goal for Celtic after 18 minutes.
Well, Richie got his hands to it, but couldn't stop the ball. So, Rangers 0, Celtic 2.
Not only had Celtic kept a safe pace with Rangers in advance of their traditional early January clash at Parkhead, they had also eased into the springtime quarterfinals in the Cup Winners' Cup, where they would be met with a much sterner task than Go Ahead Eagles or Aarhus, when Dynamo Kyiv would be their opponents. But first, a chance to go top of the pile back home with a win over their neighbours.
Which you appear to see on the picture caused by the sand which has been spit on to give the 30 to Wilson. And headed there by Chalmers. Cutting away from Stetson and then Robin. Gallagher. Johnston. I think comes to Gallagher. Murdoch. What a brilliant goal by Murdoch. Gallagher and a cannon from behind Johnston. Johnston again. And knocked in there by Chalmers.
Whilst Rangers were going down to rabble like Clyde and Dunfermline, Celtic had their tails up. Morton fell by 8 on Christmas Day, and 5 days after the Old Firm victory, Dundee United had been swatted to one side in advance of Celtic's visitors from behind the Iron Curtain for a European first leg at Celtic Park. But for some attempted skullduggery in the Soviet Union, Celtic were safely housed in the semi-finals of European competition for only the second time. 2 years prior, it had been a remarkable Hungarian comeback that nullified a 3-0 first leg victory at Parkhead in the first leg. It seemed as though Stein's side was made of sterner stuff, and they'd have to be, because Bill Shankly's Liverpool were next. By now though, Celtic had other irons in the fire. Firstly, they'd rebounded from January defeats in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, as well as in Stirling in February, to continue their march through the league in March. St Johnstone, Hamilton and Kilmarnock all tumbling. Then through the goals of Bertie Auld and Stevie Chalmers, another cup final had been pencilled in against Rangers. While Celtic had hardly been blazing through the league, Rangers had undergone a tumultuous march, being held at home to Hearts, at Kilmarnock before going down at Tannadice. It left Celtic a commanding 3 points ahead of Rangers, with no further games between the two scheduled in the league. And after grabbing 5 points from an available 6 in and amongst a European exit, Celtic and Rangers would meet at Hampden, with the former leading the championship by 2 points with 3 fixtures remaining. With matters shared in the league fixtures and in both cups, Celtic were now 3 matches away from gaining the bragging rights and the title. A nervous Celtic survived a Morton penalty miss to return from Greenock with both points, which was an imperative thanks to Rangers' win over Dunfermline. Dunfermline remained within the Old Firm vicinity for their trip to Parkhead 5 days later, as a certain Alex Ferguson opened the scoring for the Pars. Fortunately, Celtic responded in kind, Bobby Lennox and Jimmy Johnston with the goals to eke out another win. Rangers' predictable battering of Clyde was not enough to stop the party mood, as only a series of wild events on May the 7th would stop Celtic from earning their first championship flag in 12 years. And with that, it was clear that Jock Stein now had total control over the club. Within 5 days, they were in Bermuda playing a local 11, the start of a gruelling month-long tour of the Americas, which took in opponents as lofty as Spurs, Bologna and Bayern Munich. This was Jock Stein's drive right here. Tweaking in the off-season delivered the manager closer to his preferred 11. Bertie Auld was seen more and more in the midfield, and his fullback selections of Tommy Gemmell and Willie O'Neill had stuck since they had made themselves always available. Case in point, they played throughout all of the American tour. Meanwhile, Bobby's Murdoch and Lennox had long since been coaxed back into the 11. As was tradition, the 1966-67 campaign began with the League Cup group phase, which was far calmer for Celtic this time around. An 8 stuck beyond St Mirren and 6 smacked past Clyde. Some early bragging rights were even gained over Rangers via the Glasgow Cup on August 23rd. That paled into insignificance, of course, a month later when a ferocious 4-minute flurry of goals ended Rangers' involvement in the Parkhead derby in the league on September the 17th. Celtic were utterly insatiable, winning their first 8 league fixtures as well as dropping only 3 points in advance of a Hogmanay trip to Tannadice. In spite of a loss on Tay's side, Celtic held a commanding league and a rich vein of form in league competition. The sweetest win of the lot though came in the League Cup final at Hampden against the predictable opponents of Rangers.
Here's Bertie Auld. That's a beautiful cross by Auld, back by McBride. Oh, it comes Lennox, he's done it! Lennox has opened the scoring.
One trophy down, one looking as though it was on its way as well, particularly after beginning 1967 with 6 wins from 6 in the league. Despite this, a much improved Rangers were just about hanging in there in the title race. The third trophy up for grabs, of course, a Scottish Cup, which began with 11 goals without response in predictable fashion against Minnows Arbroath and Elgin City, as Rangers couldn't fulfil that portion of their season, sensationally going down to Berwick Rangers. It had long since become evident that there was a potential 4th trophy on the table as well.
Campbell comes forward, nobody taking him on decoy run. A tremendous shot, the goal by Tom Campbell. People seem to lose it. 1-0 Celtic.
Eh oui, très belle action. Et Buczynski a été à 2 doigts de marquer.
There's usually a point in the season of a champion where the entire campaign seems to snowball its momentum into an inevitability. With the pacing of French champions Nantes, Celtic won a battle back at home too when pinching Hearts' Willie Wallace from under the noses of Rangers. Good job too, since Joe McBride's knee and season gave way on Christmas Eve at Pataudry. And yet Rangers still just about hung in there in advance of the Ibrox derby that had been rearranged for May the 6th, in spite of a run of 6 consecutive wins by Celtic, trailing by just 4 points. And if Celtic had sampled the Alps and the sunny west coast of France in the earlier rounds of the European Cup, the latter part of the competition would offer very different challenges.
The European Cup, Celtic refused to be intimidated by the occasion. After Jimmy Johnston scored the first, but Willie Wallace would see them through. They would gain a 0 each draw in Prague.
Vojvodina and Dukla Prague, perhaps not the household names of today, but back in the 1960s, becoming champions of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia respectively was no mean feat. Combined with the Cold War, poorer travel and all-round discomfort in trips into the eastern half of Europe, Celtic were well worth their place in a European Cup final. They would line up in Lisbon to become not only the first Scottish team to potentially win the European Cup, or the first British one, but the first team outside of the Mediterranean to lift the European Cup. A well-versed team in Helenio Herrera's Inter Milan would meet them there. But first, domestic matters. Queen's Park had been truly beaten in the quarter-final of the Scottish Cup, but it was usual throwaways Clyde who had given Celtic a hard time in the semi-finals. Such were the nerves of a potentially groundbreaking season. Celtic were taken to a replay and only just about squeezed through that replay 2-0. Their cup final opponents would be Aberdeen. Nerves were being frayed either side of the old firm divide. When Celtic could only manage a goalless draw at home to Aberdeen, Rangers limped to a home point against Clyde 3 days later. When Celtic were busy at Hampden in the final, Rangers failed to get both points from Dens Park. It meant a potential first ever domestic treble for Celtic in their next 2 games.
Keeping it in, yes. That's a goal!
Inside forward Wallace.
The cup was won thanks to Jock Stein's tactical brilliance, from Stevie Chalmers lining up on the right instead of centrally to Jimmy Johnston's free roll throughout the field. Celtic were worthy Scottish Cup champions once again. Whilst the league wouldn't be sewn up later that week in a home defeat to Dundee United, who somehow completed the league double over Celtic, the alternative was much sweeter. The alternative was going to Ibrox, avoiding defeat and becoming Scottish champions for the 22nd time against a team who were busy preparing for their own European final.
Johnson really has been a thorn in the flesh today, taking it to that left foot again. What a strike! Magnificent! Celtic at 2-1. There's a touch inside. There's the ball. Celtic put in by Roger High. Johnson realises they are the champions.
The season was far from over. Domestic treble assured, now Jock Stein and his players touched down in the Iberian Peninsula with his Lisbon Lions to complete the greatest single footballing season ever played. Champions of Scotland, winners of both domestic cups and now champions of Europe, the quadruple was completed. Nobody had done it before, nobody has done it since, and it is likely that no team will ever do it ever again.
Bad one by Craig's a goal. A bad cross, but it worked out well for him eventually. Number 6.
Another blunder. CHANNEL made it 3-0.
The 1967-68 league campaign saw just one game lost, a none since a second matchday defeat at Ibrox, and yet still Rangers clung on in there. In winning their last 16 matches, only on the final weekend did Celtic earn their right to call themselves Scottish champions again. Whilst the Scottish Cup would not follow thanks to a stunning defeat at home to Dunfermline at the first hurdle, the League Cup certainly did. First with a scoring of 5 against Dundee, and then in the following season a 6 fell against Hibs. Despite much regression on the pitch during the 1968-69 season, Celtic scooped up all domestic honours again. 5 points ahead of Rangers in the league programme before just as commanding a victory at Hampden in the cup final weeks later. The campaign after the league was merely a formality. Thanks to an ailing Rangers side cycling through the managers, the title was scooped up by a whopping 12 points, and whilst Aberdeen stopped Celtic from another domestic treble, the League Cup had long been sewn up against St Johnstone in October 1969. Jock Stein had warned his players, and he was right. After May 25, 1967 in Lisbon, nothing in football would ever feel the same way as when they won the European Cup. The very first pit stop in repeating those heroics was stopped by a team they already knew all about, a strong Dynamo Kyiv side. Still, there were more continental, even international honours for Jock Stein's side to fight for, as they looked to become champions of the world against Argentine outfit Racing Club in the Intercontinental Cup. In a precursor for many Intercontinental Cup clashes, the football took a sideshow to a scene more akin to a Royal Rumble or a good old-fashioned scrap on Sauchiehall Street. The 3 matches, no matter who was at fault, devolved the game into a circus and was beamed worldwide. It was a stench that followed the hoops around all season. Their subsequent attempt at the European Cup was a far prettier affair and showed Celtic in a more positive light. After not only overturning a French deficit in the first round against Saint Etienne, Stein's team blew a sturdy Red Star Belgrade down in the last 16, sticking 5 beyond them at Parkhead. Any illusion that Celtic would have a 1967 repeat was swiftly dashed in the quarter-final at Parkhead when a team from Milan, Nerio Rocco's Rossoneri this time, scabbed an away goal in Glasgow before lifting the trophy aloft a month later. But there's a reason why Tom Campbell and David Potter in their seminal book on Jock Stein called the 1969-70 campaign the twilight of the gods. It's because of what happened in the European Cup.
Im Stadion an der Elland Road. Und Tor! Tor in der ersten Spielminute für Celtic.
The team was older, wiser, and some parts had changed, from Tommy Gemmell's demotion from an assured starter to Bobby Murdoch being placed in and out of quote-unquote health farms to improve his fitness, with youngsters such as Kenny Dalglish knocking on the door of the first team. Somehow this Celtic team had returned to the European Cup final. Via the unknown in Basel to the one coin toss in a glorious Lisbon defeat, Celtic had catapulted their season into promise come the other end of Hogmanay. Once there in 1970, Celtic were faced with the first ever Italian team to grace the European Cup final. No, not those from Milan, whom Jock Stein had encountered before, but Florence's own Fiorentina. They too, just like Benfica, had been thrashed comprehensively at Celtic Park before the tactically astute and experienced heads sunk in for a positive return away from home in the second leg. Their semi-final opponent came from a little closer to home. It was Don Revie and his Leeds United side, perhaps the closest thing to an equal that Celtic had south of the border. But they were chasing immortality just like Celtic, but unlike Celtic, they just didn't have the knack or the experience of a big-time European Cup game like Stein's side did. And so to Milan in the final, where unlike 3 years previously, Celtic were labelled as strong favourites against Dutch outfit Feyenoord. Feyenoord, who had overcome teams like Legia Warsaw, Vervaerts Berlin and holders Milan to be here, who hadn't so much as had a sniff at European glory in almost a decade, there seemed only one winner. Ultimately, Feyenoord at all levels proved the hungrier upstarts. Just like Stein had studied Helenio Herrera and Inter to within an inch of their lives in '67, so too did Feyenoord manager Ernst Happel had his comprehensive homework done on Celtic ahead of the showpiece event in 1970. Celtic would never reach the same heights again. There would be the odd flirtation with a European Cup, a final back in Iberia once again in 2003, but nothing would match the first Jock Stein years. But they weren't the first Scottish team to dare to venture so close to the European Cup trophy. Here's our video on Dundee's 1963 team, which did just that, even before Jock Stein.